The groundskeeper found the bodies at dawn. James Stark was making his usual rounds across the 42 acres of Briarcliff Estate on that January morning in 1931, when he noticed a car parked near the putting green. At first, he assumed it belonged to someone from nearby Emory College, whose faculty often wandered the expansive grounds. But as the Georgia sun crept higher and no one appeared, Stark walked closer to investigate. What he discovered would haunt this estate forever. Inside the automobile sat Jose Cruz, the mansion's butler, slumped against the steering wheel with a gunshot wound to his temple. In his lap lay a young woman named Gladys Fricks, just 19 years old, a bullet wound in her abdomen. The weapon, an ivory-handled pistol, belonged to Cruz's employer, the man who owned every inch of this land, every brick of the Georgian Revival mansion that loomed in the distance. That man was Asa Candler Jr., heir to one of America's greatest fortunes. And this was far from the first tragedy to touch these grounds. But to understand how a butler from the Philippines ended up dead on the manicured lawns of Atlanta's most extravagant estate, we must go back. Back to a time when a simple pharmacist bought a sweet carbonated drink for the price of a good horse. Back to the birth of an empire, and the son who would spend a lifetime trying to escape its shadow. The story of Briarcliff is the story of two Asas, a father who built everything from nothing, and a son who inherited everything and watched it crumble. In 1851, on a farm near Villa Rica, Georgia, a boy named Asa Candler was born into a world of red clay and cotton fields. He was one of 11 children raised by a prosperous merchant and planter, and from the beginning, he possessed something his siblings did not: a restless ambition, a gift for seeing opportunity where others saw only circumstance. Young Asa dreamed of becoming a doctor, but the family fortune could not stretch to cover medical school. Instead, he chose the next best thing. He became a pharmacist, learning to mix remedies and cure ailments in the back rooms of drugstores. By 1873, he had saved enough to move to Atlanta, a city still rebuilding from the ashes of the Civil War. The Atlanta that Candler found was hungry. Hungry for commerce, hungry for progress, hungry for the future. And Candler fed that hunger. He worked punishing hours, building a wholesale drug business that made him comfortable, then wealthy, then powerful. He married Lucy Elizabeth Howard, and together they had 5 children. Charles Howard came first, then in 1880, a second son arrived. They named him Asa Candler Jr. From his earliest days, this boy was different. Where his father was methodical and cautious, the son was impulsive and extravagant. Where Asa Sr. counted every penny, Asa Jr. spent money as though it were water. Friends and family called him Buddy, a nickname that would follow him to his grave. But in 1887, while young Buddy was still learning to walk, his father made a decision that would change everything. A failing pharmacist named John Stith Pemberton came to Candler's drugstore with a proposal. He had created a sweet syrup that, when mixed with carbonated water, produced a drink unlike anything else on the market. He called it Coca-Cola. Pemberton was dying, his health was failing, and he lacked the energy or resources to market his invention. But Candler saw something in those dark bubbles that the inventor could not. He saw a fountain drink that could reach every corner of America. He saw refreshment bottles shipped across oceans. He saw a brand that could become synonymous with American life itself. For $2,300, Asa Candler bought the formula. In today's terms, that amount would be roughly $60,000. What he received in return would eventually be worth billions. By 1892, Candler had founded the Coca-Cola Company. 3 years later, he could truthfully boast that his drink was sold in every state and territory in the nation. By 1901, exports had reached Europe. The famous $1 contract, in which Candler sold bottling rights for a single dollar, unleashed an army of entrepreneurs who spread the beverage across the globe. The Candler name became legendary. The family built mansions throughout Atlanta's newly developed Druid Hills neighborhood, a community that Asa Sr. himself had helped finance. In 1906, he completed the Candler Building, a 17-story monument to his success that towered over downtown Atlanta as the city's tallest structure. Its carved marble and bronze details announced to all who passed that the Candlers had arrived. But what of young Buddy? What of the son who carried his father's name, but could never seem to earn his father's approval? The letters that survive from this period paint a complicated picture. Asa Sr. loved his namesake, but he constantly worried about the boy's direction. When Buddy enrolled at Emory College in 1895, following in his older brother Howard's footsteps, trouble began almost immediately. The personal correspondence between father and son reveals a pattern of unruly antics, broken promises, and desperate attempts at redemption. One of Buddy's classmates was a young man named Alban Barkley, who would later become Vice President of the United States. But while Barkley was learning discipline and ambition, Buddy was learning something else entirely. He was learning that he would never be his father. And perhaps, deep down, he was deciding he did not want to be. After graduation, Asa Sr. sent his son to Hartwell, Georgia, to manage a struggling cotton mill. It was a test, an opportunity to prove himself. Buddy took the job seriously at first, serving as treasurer and secretary, balancing books and managing payroll. But then he met Helen McGill, the daughter of a local newspaper editor, and everything changed. They married in 1901, when both were barely 20 years old. Helen was beautiful, cultured, a leader in Atlanta society who would spend the next 26 years as Buddy's partner in all things. Their first child, a daughter named Lucy, arrived quickly. A son, John, followed. Then Laura, Helen Jr., Martha, and Samuel. But between John and Laura came a tragedy that would haunt Buddy for the rest of his life. In 1905, their baby son, Asa Griggs Candler III, died of illness in that Hartwell house. The grief shattered something inside Buddy. He lost focus on the business. The cotton mill's finances spiraled out of control. His father, recognizing the situation was beyond repair, made arrangements to bring the family back to Atlanta for good. What debts did Buddy owe his father after this failure? Family lore suggests the amount was $100,000, a staggering sum that would be reduced from his eventual inheritance. The weight of that debt, the knowledge that he had disappointed his father at the very beginning of his adult life, would shape every extravagant decision Buddy made for the next 5 decades. Back in Atlanta, Buddy bounced between positions. He held nominal roles at Coca-Cola, worked as a coal broker, sat on insurance boards, and eventually settled into managing the family's vast real estate holdings. But his true passion was something far more exciting than ledgers and property titles. Asa Candler Jr. fell in love with speed. In the early 1900s, automobiles were not mere transportation. They were technological marvels, symbols of modernity, and playthings of the wealthy. Buddy threw himself into this world with the same abandon he brought to everything else. He collected cars the way other men collected stamps, filling a 6-car garage on his Inman Park property with the finest machines money could buy. But one car stood above all others. In 1910, Buddy acquired a Lozier Briarcliff, a 4-cylinder, 45-horsepower racing machine named after the famous Briarcliff Road Race in New York. At the time, Loziers were among the most expensive automobiles in America, costing between $4,600 and $7,700. That same year, the average annual income for an American family was roughly $500. The Lozier Briarcliff was designed for endurance and speed on real-world roads. It was beautiful. It was powerful. And it was about to make Buddy famous. In 1910, the Good Roads Tour challenged drivers to race from Atlanta to New York over unpaved, rutted highways that more closely resembled trails than roads. 62 cars started the journey. Only 48 finished. And of those 48, just 7 achieved perfect scores, meaning they maintained consistent timing and suffered no mechanical breakdowns. Asa Candler Jr. was one of the 7. The Lozier Company and the Diamond Tire manufacturer ran national advertising campaigns celebrating his achievement. Newspapers across the country printed his name. For perhaps the first time in his life, Buddy had stepped out of his father's shadow and into his own spotlight. The fame went immediately to his head. He entered races at the Atlanta Speedway, a track his father had reluctantly financed. He published fanciful stories about his driving exploits that strained credulity. He announced grand pathfinding tours and speed record attempts. He even fabricated stories about his young son John being a master driver, planting photographs of the boy behind the wheel of the Lozier and sending them to newspapers across the nation. But fame, like speed, has a way of burning itself out. The Atlanta Speedway failed within 2 years, a financial disaster that forced Asa Sr. to foreclose on the property. Then, in February of 1911, a fire swept through Buddy's garage and destroyed most of his precious automobile collection. The setback might have broken another man, but Buddy simply shifted his obsession to something new. That something was a 42-acre plot of land on the edge of Druid Hills, on a road then called Williams Mill Road. The property contained a ramshackle farmhouse that most people would have torn down. But Buddy saw potential. He saw space enough for a mansion that would dwarf even his father's home. He saw room for gardens, pools, greenhouses, and entertainments beyond anything Atlanta had ever witnessed. He moved his family to the property in 1911 and immediately began planning. He named the estate Briarcliff Farm, after his beloved Lozier Briarcliff. Eventually, the road itself would be renamed Briarcliff Road, in honor of the grand property taking shape along its length. But the construction of the mansion would have to wait. First, Buddy needed something he did not yet have. He needed his inheritance. In 1919, Asa Candler Sr. made a decision that shocked the business world. After more than 3 decades of building Coca-Cola into a global empire, he gave most of his stock in the company to his children. They promptly sold their shares to a consortium of investors led by Ernest Woodruff for $25 million. Suddenly, Buddy was rich beyond his wildest dreams. Not rich from his own work, not rich from his own ingenuity, but rich because his father had built something magnificent and then given it away. The distinction mattered. It would always matter. With his newfound fortune, Buddy finally had the resources to build his palace. Ground was broken in 1920. The architect was C.E. Fraser, with Dan Bowden assisting. The style would be Georgian Revival on the outside, but the interior would be something else entirely. Something that spoke of old-world aristocracy, of Tudor England, of the kind of grandeur that new money desperately craves. The construction took 2 years. When the mansion was finally complete in 1922, local journalists were invited to tour the grounds. What they saw left them speechless. The main house sprawled across 3 stories, containing 22 rooms of richly carved wood paneling and coffered ceilings. There were 7 bedrooms, each with its own carved marble fireplace. The dining room could seat 75 guests beneath sterling silver chandeliers. A solarium flooded with natural light featured a fish pond and oil murals at either end. Outside, formal gardens blazed with exotic flowers. 2 swimming pools sparkled in the Georgia sun, one private and one open to the public for 25 cents admission. The public pool had a neon-lit fountain that glowed at night, and a stand where visitors could purchase Coca-Cola and snacks. The press dubbed it 40 acres of fairyland. But Buddy was not satisfied. He was never satisfied. In 1925, he added a massive music room that would become the mansion's crowning achievement. The 3-story vaulted space featured a Tudor interior, limestone fireplace, and walls of richly carved oak panels. 3 enormous bay windows flooded the room with light, and at one end stood an organ unlike anything Georgia had ever seen. Buddy's father owned an Aeolian organ. So did his older brother Howard, in the music room of his own mansion called Callenwold. To outdo them both, Buddy commissioned a cathedral-sized Aeolian with 88 ranks and 187 stops. The cost was $94,000, equivalent to well over $1 million today. It was the largest privately owned organ in Georgia and the 8th largest that Aeolian had ever built for a private residence. In November of 1925, family friend Palmer Christian inaugurated the organ with a recital broadcast over radio station WSB. All of Atlanta listened as music poured from those massive pipes into the evening air. Briarcliff had become everything Buddy dreamed it would be. It was larger than his father's house, more extravagant than his brother's mansion, a monument to the proposition that whatever the Candler family could do, Buddy could do bigger. Helen Candler presided over this kingdom as the Queen of Atlanta society. The local press lauded her elegant gowns and graceful presence. She hosted high teas and Rotary Club meetings, garden parties, and debutante balls. When one of Buddy's sisters introduced her daughter as a debutante with an elaborate cotillion, Helen and Buddy threw an even more spectacular debut for their own daughter, filling Briarcliff with exotic plants and driving journalists to purple prose. Throughout the 1920s, the parties at Briarcliff became legendary. Politicians and business leaders, celebrities and socialites all passed through those carved oak doors. Buddy added a golf course, tennis courts, greenhouses, and stables. He bought yachts and airplanes. His original yacht was named the Halassa, a combination of Helen and Asa. He hunted big game on safari. He rubbed elbows with the famous and the powerful. Family lore claims that Buddy's oldest surviving son, John, later said he had lived like the Great Gatsby during his young adult years. The comparison was apt. Just as Fitzgerald's doomed protagonist threw legendary parties while hiding secret wounds, so too did Buddy Candler. Because behind the glamour, behind the music and the laughter, something was terribly wrong. Buddy drank. He drank heavily and often. The alcoholism that would define his legacy in later years was already taking root during Briarcliff's golden age. His mood swung from euphoric to melancholic. His attention jumped from project to project, each new obsession burning bright before fading into abandonment. And in 1925, a new obsession captured him completely. An obsession that would lead directly to that awful January morning in 1931. Asa Candler Jr. discovered magic. The world of illusion fascinated him in a way that automobiles and yachts never had. He began collecting magic apparatus, building what would become one of the largest private collections of magical props in the world. The gold-leafed ballroom on the top floor of Briarcliff transformed into a museum of tricks and secrets. He sought out the masters of the craft. He claimed to have met Harry Houdini himself, learning tricks from the legendary escape artist. While no records confirm that Houdini ever visited Briarcliff, there was some basis for the claim. Houdini had kept his headquarters in the Candler Building in New York City, which Buddy himself managed. The two men could certainly have crossed paths. But the connection that would change everything happened on the other side of the world. During a trip to the Philippines, Buddy encountered a young magician named Jose Cruz. The performer was talented, charismatic, and willing to relocate halfway around the globe for the opportunity to work for a wealthy American. Buddy invited Cruz to come to Atlanta and serve as his personal magic assistant and butler. On April 7, 1925, 24-year-old Jose Cruz arrived in San Francisco aboard the SS President Taft. With him came his brother Philemon and a companion named Vincenzo de Vera. The three men traveled directly to Atlanta and moved into the apartment above the Briarcliff garage. For the next 6 years, Cruz became Buddy's constant companion in the world of illusion. He taught the millionaire tricks and techniques, helped him practice performances, and maintained the ever-growing collection of magical apparatus. Major industry publications like Billboard magazine noted Asa Candler Jr.'s presence in the magic community. Even David Copperfield's personal archivist would later confirm knowledge of Buddy's legendary collection. But magic was not the only thing Jose Cruz practiced at Briarcliff. In January of 1927, tragedy struck the estate. Helen Candler, Buddy's wife of 26 years, the mother of his 7 children, the queen of his fairyland kingdom, died at just 40 years old. Bishop Warren Aiken Candler, Buddy's uncle, officiated at her funeral. She was buried at Westview Cemetery. 6 months later, Buddy married Florence Adeline Stevenson of Lithonia, Georgia. Florence had worked as his secretary for 9 years. The quick remarriage raised eyebrows in Atlanta society, but Buddy had never cared much for the opinions of others. The new Mrs. Candler moved into Briarcliff and attempted to fill the role Helen had vacated. By all accounts, she stayed loyal to her husband through every wild scheme and extravagant failure that followed. Family lore suggests she was not always happy, but she went along with every nutty thing he did, as one descendant later put it. As the 1920s drew to a close, Buddy seemed to have everything. The mansion, the parties, the yachts and airplanes, the magic collection, the beautiful new wife. Then came October of 1929. The stock market crashed. America plunged into the Great Depression. The Candlers weathered the initial storm better than most. Their wealth was diversified across real estate and other holdings, not concentrated in volatile stocks. But the Depression changed the landscape in ways that even inherited fortunes could not escape. Tenants stopped paying rent. Property values collapsed. The endless flow of money that had funded Buddy's extravagance began to slow. And still, he could not stop himself. In 1932, with the nation in economic freefall, Buddy opened a zoo on the front lawn of Briarcliff. The idea was characteristically grandiose. If other wealthy men kept hunting trophies on their walls, Buddy would keep living trophies on his grounds. He commissioned architect Bowden to design cages for an expanding menagerie of exotic animals. The collection eventually included a Bengal tiger, 4 lions, a black leopard, a gorilla, baboons, and 6 elephants whose names formed a phrase that would have made his father proud. Coca-Cola, pause, refreshes, refreshing, and delicious. The neighbors were not amused. Lawsuits piled up from residents who objected to the noise, the smells, the traffic, and the occasional escaped animal. In one infamous incident, a baboon broke free from its enclosure and devoured $60 from a neighbor's purse. The legal battles drained Buddy's resources and patience. By 1933, the zoo was insolvent. Over the next 2 years, Buddy sold most of his menagerie to what is now Zoo Atlanta. The great experiment had failed, just like the Atlanta Speedway before it. But before the zoo's collapse, before the Depression truly tightened its grip on Briarcliff, came the morning of January 18, 1931. The morning James Stark found the bodies near the putting green. Jose Cruz had been more than Buddy's butler and magic assistant. He had become a trusted companion, someone who understood the lonely peculiarities of his employer's mind. He lived on the property, ate meals prepared in the Briarcliff kitchen, and moved through the mansion's halls with the easy familiarity of family. He had also begun a relationship with Gladys Fricks. She was 19 years old, pretty, The kind of young woman who might have dreamed of a different life than the one her modest background offered. Her family disapproved of Jose, a foreign man with dark skin and an uncertain future. According to testimony from friends, Gladys liked Jose, but knew her family would never accept him. On the night of January 17th, Gladys had arranged to meet Jose at Briarcliff. Friends who saw her that evening reported she seemed happy, excited even. Whatever reservations she harbored about her family's disapproval, she was not afraid. Sometime in the dark hours before dawn, Jose Cruz took an ivory-handled pistol belonging to his employer. He drove Gladys to a secluded spot near the putting green, far from the main house, far from anyone who might interrupt. And there, in that parked car, he shot her once in the abdomen. Then he turned the weapon on himself. A note was found in the car. It spoke of thwarted love and claimed that both had chosen to leave this world together rather than be kept apart. The words painted a picture of star-crossed lovers making a tragic pact. But investigators noticed something troubling. The note was written entirely in Jose's handwriting. Gladys had not signed it. Had not, apparently, written a single word. A coroner's jury was convened on the grounds of Briarcliff that very afternoon. After reviewing the evidence, including the position of the bodies and the nature of the wounds, they reached a verdict that would haunt the estate forever. Jose Cruz had murdered Gladys Fricks. She had not chosen to die. She had not participated in any pact. She had trusted a man who had betrayed that trust in the most terrible way imaginable. And after taking her life, he had followed her into the darkness he had created. The scandal made headlines from coast to coast. One of Atlanta's wealthiest families was suddenly connected to murder. The Filipino butler, the ivory-handled pistol, the deceptive farewell note, the innocent young woman killed on the manicured grounds of a millionaire's estate. It was the kind of story newspapers devour. Buddy did what he could to manage the fallout. He provided a plain pine casket for Jose and had him buried in an unmarked grave at Westview Cemetery, the same grounds where Helen lay and where Buddy himself would one day rest. Gladys Fricks was buried at Rose Hill Cemetery in Austell, Georgia. The date inscribed on her headstone was wrong, recorded as January 17th rather than the 18th. In time, the story faded from public memory. People who were alive at the time remembered, but considered it impolite to mention. The collective efforts of Buddy and law enforcement had contained the scandal before it could truly destroy him. But the damage was done. Buddy distanced himself from his beloved magic collection. The hobby that had brought Jose into his life was now tainted forever. The gold-leafed ballroom still held its tricks and apparatus, but the joy had gone out of it. And Briarcliff itself had changed. The fairyland of the 1920s had become something else. A place where a young woman had died. A place where grief and guilt and secrets lived in the shadows of the carved oak panels. The worst, however, was still to come. In the years ahead, Buddy would lose nearly everything. His fortune, his reputation, his health. He would become obsessed with death itself, pouring what remained of his money into the construction of the largest mausoleum America had ever seen. But that is a story for another chapter. For now, let us leave Briarcliff in the early 1930s, wounded but still standing, its music room silent, its putting green forever marked by tragedy. James Stark would continue his rounds across the 42 acres, past the empty zoo cages, past the swimming pools, past the spot where he had found the bodies. The servants would continue to polish the silver and tend the gardens. Florence Candler would continue to stand by her mercurial husband. And somewhere in the mansion, perhaps in the magic room that Buddy could no longer bear to enter, the ghost of Jose Cruz was already taking up residence. Or so the stories would later claim. Because Briarcliff was about to begin its long descent. From private paradise to public institution. From family home to hospital. From hospital to abandoned ruin. From ruin to legend. The haunting was just beginning. The Haunted Legacy of Coca-Cola'S Heir. Asa Candler'S Briarcliff Estate. Part 2. The 1930s arrived at Briarcliff like a slow-moving storm. Year by year the clouds gathered. Year by year the thunder grew closer. After Jose Cruz's murder of Gladys Fricks on those manicured grounds, something fundamental shifted in Asa Candler Jr. The man who had lived for superlatives, who had always sought the biggest and the best and the most spectacular, began to turn inward. The parties grew fewer. The guests grew rarer. The laughter in those carved oak halls grew thin. The zoo's failure in 1933 only accelerated the decline. Lawsuits continued to pile up, not just from neighbors who had objected to escaped baboons and elephant trumpeting at dawn, but from business partners and real estate dealings gone sour. Buddy had always operated on instinct rather than careful planning. And now those instincts were failing him. Yet even as his fortune dwindled, his obsession only intensified. It simply shifted to a new target. Westview Cemetery had existed since 1884, when 21 local men purchased 3 farms on land where Confederate and Union soldiers had clashed just 2 decades earlier. By 1930, when Buddy became involved with the Cemeteries Association, it was one of the largest non-profit cemeteries in the United States. But it was not, in Buddy's estimation, magnificent enough. He had visited Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California, created by a visionary named Hubert Eaton. Forest Lawn had transformed the American cemetery from a grim repository of the dead into a celebratory memorial park, filled with sculptures and art and landscaped beauty. In 1931, Eaton unveiled a magnificent stained glass recreation of the Last Supper in his mausoleum. Buddy decided he would build something even grander in Atlanta. By 1933, the Great Depression had weakened the original owner's hold on Westview. Buddy took full control and immediately began implementing his vision. Between 1940 and 1950, he transformed the cemetery grounds into his version of Eaton's Memorial Park, complete with a garden of memories featuring bronze markers flush to the ground. But the centerpiece would be something unprecedented: the Westview Abbey and Mausoleum. Construction began in 1943, designed by California architect Clarence Lee Jay and mausoleum builder Cecil Bryan. When completed, it would hold 11,444 crypts under a single roof, making it the largest such structure ever built. The design was Spanish plateresque, featuring fan-vaulted ceilings, 70 stained glass windows, and 21 paintings by Hungarian artist Bartholomew Mako. Buddy envisioned himself entombed there in a place of special honor, resting in a marble sarcophagus within the building he had created. Death, it seemed, had become his final obsession. If he could not be remembered for building something that lasted during his life, perhaps he could build something that would last through eternity. But even death would not cooperate with Buddy Candler's plans. While he poured money into Westview, Briarcliff continued its decline. The estate was expensive to maintain, and the endless lawsuits consumed what remained of his fortune. In 1938, hoping to generate new income, Buddy opened a commercial laundry business on the property. Briarcliff Laundry became the largest cleaning and cold storage facility in the Southeast. You might notice the pattern by now. The largest organ, the largest mausoleum, the largest laundry. For Buddy, size itself was the point. If he could not be his father, he could at least be bigger than his father in everything he attempted. He handed daily operations to his sons John and Samuel, freeing himself to focus entirely on Westview. The laundry existed primarily to fund his cemetery renovations. Every dollar that came in went back out toward marble and stained glass and bronze markers. Then, in 1943, disaster struck. Fire swept through Briarcliff Laundry and leveled it completely. The investigation that followed revealed something troubling. The business had been charging customers fees for insurance premiums to cover loss or damage to their property. But Buddy had never actually secured sufficient insurance to pay out on those claims. Suddenly, the Candler name was associated not just with eccentricity, but with potential fraud. Buddy and his sons John and Samuel faced federal charges. The trial dragged through the courts, drawing more negative attention to a family that had once been universally admired. In April of 1944, all three were acquitted. But the legal fees had drained still more resources, and the damage to their reputation could not be undone. Through it all, Florence stayed by her husband's side. Whatever she thought of his schemes, whatever frustrations she harbored, she remained loyal. She would remain loyal until the very end, and even beyond. By 1948, Buddy could no longer afford to maintain Briarcliff. The 42 acres of fairyland had become a burden he could not carry. In that year, he sold the entire estate to the General Services Administration with the expectation that it would become a veterans' hospital. The Candlers moved out of the mansion they had called home for more than 3 decades. They relocated to the Briarcliff Hotel and Apartments, a building Buddy himself had constructed years earlier at the corner of Ponce de Leon Avenue and North Highland Avenue. It was comfortable, but hardly comparable to the estate they had left behind. Florence reportedly was not happy about the move, but she went along with it. She always went along with it. The planned Veterans Hospital never materialized. Instead, in 1953, the estate found a different purpose. The Georgian Clinic opened in the mansion as the first alcohol treatment facility in Georgia. There is a bitter irony here that cannot be overlooked. Asa Candler Jr. had struggled with alcoholism his entire adult life. The drinking that had fueled his moods and shaped his reputation would now, in a sense, be treated within the walls of the home he had built. The fairyland, designed for parties and excess, became a place of recovery and rehabilitation. Buddy did not live to see this transformation take its full shape. On January 11, 1953, Asa Griggs Candler Jr. died from a liver malignancy. He was 72 years old. The newspapers described his life as one of the most colorful and eventful of the century. A family friend offered a more nuanced assessment. Asa Candler Jr. was a dreamer and a doer. He didn't do anything small. His estate was valued at around $2 million, a fraction of the fortune he had once controlled. He left most of the money to Florence and his 5 surviving children. He also left $8,500 to each of 7 servants, a gesture that reflected his strange mixture of extravagance and loyalty. His burial became a point of contention. Buddy had expected to be entombed in a marble sarcophagus within his beloved Westview Abbey, in a place of special honor within the mausoleum he had created. But Florence had different ideas. Some of his children fought her, believing their father should have his final wish honored. But Florence won. She had gone along with every nutty thing he did during his life. In death, she would finally have her way. Asa Candler Jr. was interred not in the grand mausoleum, but in the lawn of the family plot at Westview, next to his first wife Helen and his firstborn son Asa III, who had died in infancy nearly 50 years earlier. Florence later erected a monument in his honor, but it was simple and unobtrusive, easy to drive past without noticing. Buddy would have never agreed to such modesty. His headstone lies flat to the ground, often covered by dried grass clippings. An ant colony has taken over the corner near his son John's marker. The marble sarcophagus he had designed for himself sits empty within the abbey, forever waiting for a body that will never arrive. Back at Briarcliff, the Georgian Clinic continued its work. The public pool that had once glowed with neon fountains at night was kept open for patients until the late 1950s, when lack of funds forced its closure and eventual filling. Then, in 1965, the estate entered its most haunted chapter. The Georgia Mental Health Institute opened on the Briarcliff grounds, constructed on approximately 32 acres of the former estate. The new facility was designed by architect Thomas Bradbury in the brutalist style, a stark concrete tower that contrasted sharply with the Georgian Revival elegance of the original mansion. The institute featured 5 stories of clinical space, underground utility tunnels, conference rooms, laboratories, and an auditorium. The Candler Mansion itself was repurposed for auxiliary functions, including continued alcohol treatment and counseling services. A semicircular arrangement of cottages connected to the main hospital through underground tunnels. These passages allowed staff to transport patients from ward to hospital without ever going outside. It also prevented patients from having opportunities to escape. For the next 32 years, the Georgia Mental Health Institute treated some of the most troubled minds in the state. One ward in particular earned a grim reputation. Ward 5 was known as the Mass Murder Ward. A former employee who worked there decades later struggled to describe what she had witnessed. "I cannot really even describe what these people were like," she said, "because I have never experienced anything even close to it." The stories that emerged from those years would later fuel Briarcliff's reputation as one of the most haunted locations in Georgia. Patients crying out in the night, unexplained footsteps in empty corridors, cold spots in rooms that should have been warm. Staff members reported seeing figures that vanished when approached. Some refused to work certain shifts. Others quit entirely rather than spend another night in those halls. One woman, who claimed to have worked as a nurse at the facility, was found wandering the grounds years later, picking at her own skin until it bled. Whatever had happened there had taken a toll from which she never recovered. How much of this is true? How much is exaggeration fed by the natural human tendency to find horror in abandoned places? The answer may not matter. What matters is that Briarcliff had become something its builder never intended. A repository not of parties and magic and extravagance, but of suffering and secrets and the troubled human mind. In 1997, the Georgia Department of Human Resources proposed closing the Georgia Mental Health Institute due to rising costs. The facility had a $24.5 million budget and 141 beds. It was no longer economically viable. When the doors finally closed, Emory University acquired the property. The school renamed it the Briarcliff campus and began using portions of the site for library storage and administrative functions. But the mansion itself and the brutalist hospital building sat largely empty. Abandoned buildings have a way of attracting attention. Urban explorers began finding ways onto the property, documenting the decay with photographs and videos. Paint peeled from walls that had once been covered in silk. Hospital beds rusted in basements that had once held wine cellars. The grand staircase, down which Helen Candler had descended in her elegant gowns, now featured broken banisters and debris. Documentary photographer Brian McGrath Davis spent countless hours alone inside the mansion, even at night. He later admitted that while he personally never felt spooked, he knew people who worked on the Briarcliff campus who were convinced it was haunted. The stories multiplied. The ghost of Jose Cruz wandering the grounds where he had committed his terrible act. The spirits of patients who had suffered and died within the institute's walls. The shade of Buddy Candler himself, unable to rest because Florence had denied him his marble sarcophagus. Each tale added another layer to Briarcliff's dark reputation. Then, Hollywood discovered the estate. The brutalist hospital building, with its stark concrete facades and institutional corridors, proved perfect for depicting government facilities with sinister secrets. Television crews arrived to film productions including Vampire Diaries and Doom Patrol. But the most famous use came in 2016, when the Netflix series Stranger Things chose Briarcliff's Building A as the exterior and interior of Hawkins National Laboratory. In the show, this fictional facility conducts secret experiments on children, opening a portal to a nightmarish alternate dimension. Suddenly, millions of viewers around the world knew Briarcliff's silhouette, even if they did not know its real history. Fans began making pilgrimages to the site, hoping to glimpse the building where 11 had been held captive. Few noticed the traces of the famously eccentric Coca-Cola'S Heir's extravagance nearby. The irony would not have been lost on Buddy. He had spent his entire life seeking attention and headlines. Now attention had come, but for a building he had nothing to do with, celebrating a story that was entirely fictional. Through decades of neglect, the mansion somehow survived. Emory University maintained a policy of benevolent neglect, chasing away vandals and occasionally renting the property to film crews whose repairs helped stave off greater collapse. A new roof here, boarding on windows there. Just enough to keep the structure standing without truly restoring it. In 1988, Briarcliff was listed on the National Register of Historic Places. The designation recognized its significance, but provided no funding for preservation. The carved oak panels continued to deteriorate. The solariums leaked. The music room where the great Aeolian organ had once thundered stood silent and empty, its pipes long since removed and donated to Wesleyan College in Macon. Proposals came and went. Plans for a boutique hotel, schemes for condominiums. Each project failed to materialize, defeated by the enormous cost of restoration and the complicated history that clung to every room. Then, in 2022, something unexpected happened. Emory University brokered a long-term ground lease with Gallery Living, a developer specializing in senior living communities. Under the agreement, Gallery would restore the Candler Mansion to its original design and use it as an event space open to the public. The surrounding property would become a senior living community called Corso Druid Hills, featuring approximately 500 units. The brutalist hospital building that had served as Hawkins' laboratory would be demolished. Its institutional history, both real and fictional, would be erased from the landscape. But the mansion, the original 40 acres of fairyland, would finally receive the care it had been denied for so many decades. Restoration work began. Workers discovered layers of history hidden beneath later modifications. They identified which parts were original and which had been added during the hospital renovation. They found the foundations of the ill-fated zoo. They traced the outlines of the gardens that had once blazed with exotic flowers. Sarah Butler, the author who had written a biography of Buddy Candler, served as an informal guide to the property's secrets. She had started researching Briarcliff out of simple curiosity about an abandoned mansion in the suburbs. What she found was a story that stretched from Villa Rica to the Philippines, from the Coca-Cola empire to the world of magic, from the heights of Gilded Age excess to the depths of institutional decay. The Candlers were a huge part of this city's history, Butler observed, and their homes inspire curiosity and storytelling that connect present-day Atlantans with the city's past. Sometimes the best way to get a community invested in itself is by appreciating and preserving the weird, fun, inexplicable stories. We make friends with our past when we are allowed to smile at it. What will the restored Briarcliff become? A place for weddings and galas and community events, they say. A gathering space where new memories will be made in rooms that have seen so much. Perhaps couples will exchange vows in the same solarium where Buddy's daughter once married. Perhaps laughter will once again fill the music room where the great organ used to play. But the ghosts will not leave entirely. They never do. Some buildings absorb the lives lived within their walls. The joy and the sorrow, the triumph and the tragedy, seep into the stone and wood and remain long after the people are gone. Briarcliff is absorbed more than most. A child who died of illness, a wife taken too young, a murder that shattered the illusion of paradise, decades of troubled minds seeking treatment behind locked doors, the slow decay of a monument to ego and excess. Walk through those halls today, if you can find a way inside. Feel the weight of history pressing down. Listen for the footsteps that people swear they hear. Look for the figures that vanish when you turn your head. Jose Cruz may or may not haunt the grounds where he killed Gladys Fricks. Buddy Candler may or may not wander the rooms he could never quite fill with enough grandeur. The patients of the Mental Health Institute may or may not linger in the corridors where they suffered. But something remains. Something always remains. Asa Candler Sr. built an empire from nothing but ambition and a sweet, carbonated drink. His son spent a lifetime trying to match that achievement and never came close. The mansions they built still stand, monuments to different kinds of success and failure. In Westview Cemetery, the abbey that Buddy created waits for completion that may never come. The third floor remains largely unfinished, boarded up and empty. The marble sarcophagus he designed for himself holds no body. The dreams of grandeur that drove him through 7 decades rest as unfulfilled in death as they were in life. But at Briarcliff, something new is beginning. The mansion that was fairyland, then hospital, then ruin, is being reborn. The carved oak panels will be polished. The solariums will be repaired. The gardens will bloom again. Whether the ghosts will approve remains to be seen. After all, Buddy Candler wanted attention more than anything else in the world. He wanted people to notice him, to remember him, to speak his name with the same reverence they gave his father. For decades after his death, that wish went unfulfilled. His history was confused with his father's. His achievements were forgotten or misattributed. His mansion crumbled in obscurity. Now the attention has finally come. Researchers have dug into archives and uncovered the real story. Writers have published books and articles restoring his place in Atlanta's history. The restoration of Briarcliff will ensure that the estate he built survives to inspire curiosity in generations yet unborn. Perhaps, somewhere, Buddy is satisfied at last. Or perhaps he is still waiting, still hoping, still dreaming of the superlative that will finally prove he was worthy of the name he inherited. The grounds of Briarcliff have seen so much: speed and fire, parties and funerals, lions and elephants, magic tricks and murder, mental anguish and slow decay. And now, resurrection. Stand at the front of the mansion as the sun sets over Atlanta. Watch the light change across the Georgian Revival facade. Listen to the wind moving through the trees that Buddy planted a century ago. If you are very quiet, you might hear something. Music, perhaps, drifting from a room that has been silent for decades. Or footsteps, walking the grounds where tragedy once unfolded. Or laughter, echoing across 42 acres of fairyland that exists now only in memory. The haunted legacy of Coca-Cola'S Heir lives on, in the walls that survived, in the stories that persist, in the questions that will never be fully answered. Briarcliff endures, and so do its ghosts.